Um, this video provides some tips and tricks on Thermaldry Elite Plank basement flooring. This is as much for my future self as for anyone else who might have this flooring and need to be installing it themselves. But this is basically it's a plastic flooring that's used for finishing basements. It's inorganic, so you're not going to have any kind of issues with mold or anything if the flooring gets wet. It's also flexible, so you have a little more play to work with in an environment where your floor might not be perfectly level. If you have any kind of like bumps or slopes or anything in your basement concrete flooring that you're putting it over. If you've installed wood laminate flooring in a house before, the installation is pretty similar to that. Basically, you would start in the corner of the room. You would put the two flat sides of the Elite Plank flooring in that corner. You'd have the edge with these loops and the end with the loops pointing out into the room. You'd then attach more planks. They have little hooks in the bottom that line up with those loops into that, and you work your way down the row. When you get to the end of the row in the room, you'll cut off the end that normally has the loops on it, so that you can tuck it under the baseboard at the end of the room to complete the row. Then the beginning of the next row, you would use a partial board. Again, kind of similar to laminate flooring, because you don't want all the seams basically to line up into a straight line all across your room. You would kind of have them alternating. The trick, of course, with this is that you don't have that kind of limitless freedom of moving it around at different points on the next row. You have to make sure that the hooks line up with the loops of the previous row. So when you start the next row with a partial board, you may find that you need to cut off a little extra in order to get the loop to line up, but still have the end of the board reach the wall and not be too far away or anything like that. As far as putting it together, you're really just lining up these hooks with the loops, and normally if I'm standing up, I just step on it, but you just kind of knock it all down into place, and then it's all connected. You just walk around on it and snap it into place. One thing to note is that these are each plank is basically two pieces, so there's kind of a flexible plastic framing, and then this kind of facing on it that's the kind of faux wood look to it. It's also textured as well. So that facing is just laid on there with a little bit of adhesive. You can just kind of flex it to break it off. And that's interesting for a couple reasons, in that if the facing gets damaged at some point, you have a big scratch in it, or you drop something heavy on it and crack it or something, you don't need to disconnect the entire board from the floor. Like you don't need to take out the framing. If you have a new one of these to replace it with, you can just use just kind of a very thin paint scraper around the edge, and you can get in there and pry that up and replace it. A important kind of gotcha to know about that is that because there's just a little bit of adhesive holding the facing on, and otherwise it's kind of held in place by the framing that's around the edge of the plank. Once you cut the end of the plank, that framing is no longer there, and over time, stepping on it, you can have the issue where this facing is kind of pulling back and you get this kind of gap at the end of your board. So during installation or even afterwards, if you notice that start to happen, you can pry up the facing and just put a couple drops of like a gel Gorilla Glue in there. Then put the facing down and just make sure you get the facing right up to the edge while it dries. And then generally you won't have that issue with it sliding and creating that gap. So there are pros and cons to this. Like I mentioned earlier, that one kind of con, I guess I would say, is not having total freedom as far as where the boards line up with each other. You have to line up the hooks with the loops. So as you start a row, you might need to do some extra cuts to make the partial board fit into those loops. But once you get one lined up, you can just kind of keep going and do the whole row. The really kind of neat upside is that being flexible, you don't, like in this case, I'm not even going to remove the baseboard trim in the room as I replace this, because I can actually just flex and pull the plank out from underneath it. And when I put in the new planks, I can just flex it and stick it underneath, which is pretty neat. And removing the existing flooring, with wood laminate flooring, you would need to start basically in the corner of the room that you had previously finished. You don't need to, in the case of Thermaldry Elite Plank, you can just start at any place in the room using a really thin paint scraper. You can work your way in between and just pry up the hooks. You just need to know which side of the planks have the loops on them. Once you figure that out, you're pretty much good to go. So all you do, and I'll show it on these gray pieces, you're working in between the seam, in between the framing pieces of two boards, and you kind of just line it up with where one of the loops is, and you're going to pry the hook out of the loops. So in this case, the loop is in this back board. The hook is part of this front board, so we're going to pry kind of away from me towards the board that has the hooks. And you get the kind of snap. The hooks and loops are 3 inches apart from each other, so you can kind of just move along if you can't see them, and work your way down the plank. And this isn't damaging the board or anything. If you do end up in between two loops, you might see the plank flexing a lot, but not popping out. That flexing could damage the board. You get kind of marks on it. So if that starts to happen, just stop and move along a little further. And then once you get all of them out, the board is disconnected. It's easier with these two boards that are not attached to anything else, but I'll show you here. So this floor is all fully installed. This is what we're going to be replacing, the brown with the gray. We added another room. We liked the gray better, so we're just kind of going back and replacing this. So in this case, this was the wall that the flooring was started on. So the loops are facing away from that wall, kind of towards me. And you can kind of look at the seam at the end of a row here, and we'll know that there's a loop basically right there. So I'm going to work into that with our paint scraper. It's a little tighter, obviously, than doing those gray pieces earlier. And then I'm going to push towards the wall to pop the hook out of the loop of this plank. So and there's one. And once you get one, so now we know it's 3 inches away, you can just work your way down. And I should say that this is the board I'm targeting to remove, but you have to remove the loops on both sides, of course. Work my way down. That one I felt a little bit of flexing because I wasn't lined up with loops, so I just moved a little further to the right and found where the loop was. For the video, I'm doing this with my bare hands, but if I'm doing a lot of boards all at once, I will put on gloves. Otherwise, just the rubbing of the paint scraper on your hands and everything can cut you eventually. Okay, so that's the whole side of this is now loose. So now we're going to do the other side, and it's just the same idea. Really, you're just finding any place along the edge that you can start it in. I might actually go along here to start. Let's see if I can get the matter of where you can get the paint scraper in. Also, you can kind of pull up. You can see all the whole floor flexes. If you do that, that can help open some gaps. So doing that, I'm able to get my paint scraper in here. And in this case, the loops are on this end of the board, the far end over here. So we're going to pull the paint scraper back in that direction to pop the hooks out of this board out of the loops of the previous board. So two loops on the end, so we got those two out. Now, see if we can get down this this far side. Once you get one on the edge you're working on, the rest get kind of easier. And obviously, once you have one row out, the next row gets a lot easier when you're taking these out. On the final edge here. Now the piece I'm removing is the one that has the loops sticking out the end, so we're going to pry kind of towards the board we're taking out in this case. Make sure you're getting in between the pieces of the actual frame, not in between the frame and the laminate and the facing. So now I've got all the hooks popped out of the loops. And I'm just gonna flex it and pull it out, and so there's one piece taken out, and now it's easier to work our way basically in any direction from this. Because I'm removing an existing flooring and I'm not taking the trim off the wall, you have to start by removing planks further from the wall, and then once you have the whole row removed before the row that is against the wall, you can just pull it out from underneath the baseboard trim. And as you're putting it back in, just always have the row next to it empty, and you can kind of work your way just across the room by doing that. I think that's all the tips I can think of. If I have any others, I'll write them in text on the description of this video. But hopefully, for myself or for others, this can be useful information for working with the flooring.